It started as an ordinary weekend outing to an estate sale, one of those charming old Victorian homes filled with antique treasures. Among the sea of knickknacks, dusty furniture, and aging portraits, there sat a doll, perched on a faded velvet armchair. It was dressed in an old-fashioned lace dress, with a porcelain face painted in a serene expression and eyes that seemed to glimmer with life. A young couple, Sarah and David, noticed the doll almost instantly. Something about its eerie beauty drew them closer. Despite a creeping feeling of unease, Sarah felt compelled to take it home. The owner of the estate saw Sarah eyeing the doll and quickly approached her. She was a frail old woman, with a look of weariness in her eyes that made Sarah hesitate. "Are you sure you want her?" the woman asked in a hushed tone. Sarah laughed it off, nodding as she held the doll in her hands. The woman just shook her head slowly, muttering something Sarah couldn't quite catch. It sounded like, "She doesn't like being ignored." Once the doll was in their home, small things began to happen. At first, it was subtle. A door creaking open, faint footsteps in the hallway at night. Sarah joked that it was their new house guest. But David wasn't amused. He felt watched, and the doll seemed to have a constant, shifting gaze that made him feel uncomfortable. No matter where they placed her, her eyes always seemed to meet his. One night, while David was working late, Sarah was alone with the doll. She set it on a chair in their living room, wanting to adjust its dress, which seemed to always fall out of place. As she did, she noticed that its delicate porcelain lips seemed slightly parted, as if caught mid-whisper. She dismissed the thought, thinking it was just her imagination. But that night, Sarah was awakened by a soft humming, an old melody drifting through the house. She thought it was a neighbor playing music, but as she strained to listen, she realized the sound was coming from her own living room. Against her better judgment, Sarah crept down the stairs, her heart pounding. As she rounded the corner, she froze. The doll sat in the same chair, but now its head was turned, its eyes wide open and fixed directly on her. And its lips, they were slightly moving, as if it were mouthing the tune. She could barely breathe as she backed away, feeling the walls closing in around her. She bolted back to her room, locking the door behind her and leaving the light on until morning. David was skeptical when Sarah recounted what she'd seen. "It's just a doll," he said, rolling his eyes. But that night, he kept hearing the faint sound of scratching on their bedroom door. He tried to ignore it, brushing it off as a tree branch or a trick of his mind. But as the nights went on, the scratching grew louder, more insistent. He finally went to investigate one night, steeling himself as he opened the door to their bedroom. There was nothing there. But when he looked down the hallway, he saw the doll. It was sitting in the center of the hallway floor, facing their bedroom. Sarah hadn't left it there. He felt a chill run through him as he picked it up, bringing it back to the living room. But the doll felt heavier now, colder, as if it were resisting his hold. From then on, their nights were filled with strange occurrences. Lights flickered, and the doll's position would change despite them never touching it. One evening, while searching for some old family photos, Sarah found an envelope tucked inside the doll's dress. Inside was a photograph, yellowed and frayed, of a young girl holding the very same doll. The girl's face was solemn, with wide, haunted eyes. On the back, scrawled in faded ink, were the words, "Do not let her see you." That night, they decided to lock the doll in a wooden chest in the attic. David hammered the lid shut, hoping that would put an end to the disturbances. But the moment he finished, a loud, echoing thump sounded from inside the chest, as if something were desperately trying to escape. The couple bolted down the stairs, feeling a mixture of dread and relief. They locked the attic door and decided they would deal with it in the morning. But sleep didn't come. Around 3 a.m., the house shook with a series of violent bangs, like something heavy was being tossed around. They both jolted awake, their hearts racing as they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps descending from the attic. The footsteps stopped just outside their bedroom door, which slowly creaked open. The room felt icy, a bitter chill flooding the air. The doll was there. It was in the doorway, its face twisted in a wide, unnatural grin. Its eyes, which had once seemed delicate and hand-painted, now glowed with a malevolent spark. It began to move, a jerky, puppet-like motion, advancing slowly toward their bed. Sarah and David scrambled back, pressing against the headboard. their breaths coming in short, terrified gasps. Just as the doll reached the foot of their bed, it tilted its head, its gaze locking onto Sarah. She felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if her entire being were being drained. She tried to scream, but her voice was locked in her throat. In that moment, she understood what the estate woman had meant. The doll didn't just want to be kept. It wanted to be loved, adored, worshipped. And it would take nothing less. David lunged forward, grabbing the doll and flinging it across the room. It hit the wall with a shattering crash, pieces of porcelain scattering across the floor. The eyes went dark, the room fell silent. They both sat there, trembling, barely daring to believe it was over. But as the dawn crept in, they felt an unmistakable presence. In the corner of the room, a faint whisper, soft but clear, broke the silence. "I'll never leave you." They left the house that very day, abandoning everything inside. Weeks later, they heard that another family had moved in, charmed by the quaint Victorian home and its antique furnishings, and when they saw a picture of the new family in the local newspaper, they saw it. There, sitting in the background of the photo, was the doll, pristine, whole, and wearing that same unnatural, chilling smile. There was a doll named Amelia, not one you'd find in any toy store, but one carefully, painstakingly crafted 100 years ago by a skilled doll maker. She was a Victorian beauty with a blue satin dress, lifelike glass eyes, and black curls cascading around her porcelain face. Amelia was the dollmaker's masterpiece. But he had no idea that his creation was somehow different from any doll he'd made before. Amelia had a life of her own, a darkness woven deep into her delicate frame. For decades, Amelia sat untouched in an old, forgotten attic of an abandoned house in upstate New York. No one knew how she had come to be there, but rumors swirled that her previous owners had left in the dead of night, abandoning their belongings and disappearing without a trace. Local children dared each other to sneak into the house, but few made it past the eerie stillness that seemed to grip the place. That was until Margaret, an antique collector, discovered Amelia during one of her hunts. She found the house decaying and decrepit, but still holding fragments of its former elegance. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw Amelia sitting on a dusty shelf, her eyes seemingly fixed on Margaret, following her every movement with uncanny precision. Margaret felt a chill creep up her spine, but she brushed it off. She was a practical woman, and a rare doll like this would be worth a small fortune. She bought it without hesitation, taking it back home to her small antique shop. But strange things began happening the moment Amelia entered the shop. Customers would stop by, drawn by the delicate beauty of the doll, only to leave unsettled, feeling watched. One man swore he saw her blink, but laughed it off, thinking it was a trick of the light. Another woman whispered that she heard soft giggles when she was near Amelia, but Margaret dismissed it. After all, Amelia was just a doll. That night, Margaret locked up the shop, leaving Amelia sitting on a shelf by the counter. She didn't know that as soon as the door closed, the shop fell silent, the lights flickering and dimming as a strange energy filled the room. Hours passed, and the shop remained quiet until the dead of night, when Margaret was startled awake by a sound she couldn't identify. It was faint but persistent, a soft scraping, like nails dragging along wood. Her heart pounding, she got out of bed, realizing that the sound was coming from her shop, directly below her apartment. She crept down the stairs, and as she reached the bottom, the lights flickered again, casting eerie shadows around the room. There, in the darkness, Amelia sat, still as ever, but something was different. The faintest smirk seemed to play on her lips. Margaret froze, a cold sweat breaking out as she took a step back, her pulse pounding in her ears. The scraping sound had stopped, but she was sure she'd heard it, sure it had come from right where Amelia was sitting. But there was no one else in the shop, no animal, no logical explanation. Trying to shake off her fear, Margaret whispered to herself, "It's just a doll." She returned upstairs, but sleep didn't come easily. She could feel Amelia's eyes on her, even behind closed doors, and every small sound kept her on edge. The following days grew more unsettling. Items would fall off shelves in the shop when Margaret's back was turned, and once, when she was dusting Amelia, she noticed that the doll's dress seemed torn, shredded at the edges, as though someone or something had clawed at it. But the strangest part was that she could have sworn the doll's eyes were no longer simply glass. They seemed deeper, more aware, as though something stared back from within. One night, as she sat alone in her apartment, a loud crash echoed from downstairs. Margaret shot out of bed, her heart pounding, and rushed down the stairs. There, in the middle of her shop, was Amelia lying face down on the floor, her glass eyes cracked and jagged, staring at nothing. Horrified, Margaret knelt to pick her up, feeling a strange, icy chill emanate from the doll. That's when she felt it. A small, sharp prick on her hand. She jerked back, looking down to see a drop of blood welling up from a tiny cut on her palm. Shaken, she looked at Amelia and could have sworn the doll's cracked lips had shifted into a smile. Margaret tried to rid herself of the doll the next morning, but no matter what she did, Amelia would always find her way back into the shop. She tried selling it, giving it away, even throwing it in the trash, but Amelia would be back, in the same spot on the shelf, staring with those fractured glass eyes. Desperate, she took the doll to a priest who listened to her story with grim concern. He took Amelia, placed her on the altar, and began to pray. As the priest's voice filled the room, a cold wind swept through, rattling the doors and windows. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, as the priest's voice grew louder, more desperate. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, and the lights flickered out. When they came back on, the priest lay on the ground, gasping for breath, his eyes wide with horror as he looked at the doll, which remained eerily still. "There's something inside her," he whispered, his voice shaking. Something angry. Margaret, now terrified, decided there was only one option left. She took Amelia to the woods, dug a deep hole, and buried her, covering the ground with rocks and leaving without looking back. But even now, years later, Margaret can feel Amelia's presence. At night, she hears soft scratching at her windows, faint whispers drifting through the darkness. And once, when she woke in the dead of night, she saw her. Amelia, standing at the foot of her bed, her cracked glass eyes filled with rage, her dress tattered, her lips twisted into that chilling, unnatural smile. In a small town in Maine, there was an antique shop called The Lost Time, known for its peculiar dusty assortment of old clocks, faded paintings, and vintage toys. Its centerpiece, though, was an unusual doll. She was larger than most dolls, almost child-sized, with glassy, pale blue eyes, a frilly white dress, and a face so delicately crafted that she almost seemed alive. Her name, carved into the wooden plaque beneath her, was Annabelle. The shopkeeper, Tom, was an elderly man who rarely spoke of the doll, but those who had known him longest whispered about how he'd once tried to get rid of it. They said he'd sold it 3 different times, and each time the doll had returned, left outside the shop door by morning. "She's cursed," they would say. "She doesn't like to be away from her home." But one winter night, a young woman named Claire, who had recently moved to town, wandered into the Lost Time. She was a doll collector with a particular fascination for eerie antique dolls. So when her eyes fell on Annabelle, she was transfixed. The doll's blue eyes seemed to follow her, gleaming with an intensity that sent chills down her spine. Despite the shopkeeper's warning, Claire insisted on buying Annabelle, convinced she was the perfect addition to her collection. As she walked home, snowflakes falling softly around her, she thought she heard faint laughter, but when she looked back, no one was there. She shrugged it off, blaming her overactive imagination. When Claire finally brought Annabelle home, she placed her on a shelf in her living room, facing the couch. Claire lived alone, but as the night went on, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She kept glancing at Annabelle, who sat perfectly still, her pale eyes fixed on her with unnerving intensity. Claire laughed it off, reminding herself that she'd always loved the eerie charm of dolls. But that night, she awoke around 3 a.m. to the sound of soft footsteps. Her heart raced as she lay in bed, straining to listen. The steps grew louder, slow and deliberate, moving from the living room toward her bedroom. Claire held her breath, frozen in terror as the steps stopped just outside her door. She could see a shadow cast under the door frame, small, child-sized, standing perfectly still. After several agonizing minutes, the shadow disappeared. Claire gathered her courage, got up, and cautiously opened her bedroom door. The hallway was empty, the house silent. She tiptoed to the living room, her heart pounding, and found Annabelle still on her shelf, looking innocent and undisturbed. Claire shook her head, convincing herself it had all been a dream. But over the next few nights, the sounds grew worse. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. It was whispers, low and unintelligible, echoing from the corners of her room. Sometimes Claire could swear she heard someone humming a lullaby. She tried covering Annabelle with a cloth, hoping that out of sight would mean out of mind, but it didn't help. Each night, the noises seemed to grow louder, more insistent. One night, she had a friend, Mark, come over. Claire didn't mention the strange occurrences, but she did notice that Mark seemed uneasy. As they talked, his eyes kept darting over to Annabelle. Finally, he laughed nervously and asked, "Does that doll look different every time you look at it? Like she's moving?" Claire's blood ran cold. She hadn't told anyone about her suspicions, but here was Mark, a practical, skeptical guy, confirming her worst fears. That night, Claire decided to lock Annabelle in her closet, hoping it would bring some peace. She placed the doll inside, shut the door, and just to be safe, pushed a heavy chair in front of it. She went to bed, feeling a tentative sense of relief, but that relief was short-lived. Around midnight, she was jolted awake by a loud bang coming from the closet. It was followed by a series of scratches, slow and deliberate, dragging against the inside of the door. Claire lay in bed, paralyzed with fear, listening as the scratching turned into pounding. She could hear Annabelle's faint, muffled laughter. She covered her ears, lay, trying to block it out, but the sound seemed to seep through the walls, filling her mind with dread. Suddenly, the banging stopped, and an eerie silence settled over the room. Claire's heart raced as she waited, barely daring to breathe. Then, with a soft click, the closet door creaked open. She stared in horror as the door swung wider, revealing the darkness within. Slowly, Annabelle stepped out, her once lifeless glass eyes now gleaming with a cold, malicious light. Her tiny porcelain hand raised, pointing directly at Claire. Desperate, Claire scrambled to her feet, running out of her apartment, down the hallway, and into the freezing night. She didn't stop until she was halfway down the block, panting and shivering, unsure of what to do. She couldn't go back there, not with Annabelle waiting. She called Mark, begging him to help. He arrived within minutes, and together they returned to the apartment. They found the closet door wide open, and Annabelle was sitting on Claire's bed, her small hands folded neatly in her lap, her head tilted in a silent, knowing stare. "This has to end," Mark whispered, his voice barely more than a tremble. They wrapped Annabelle in a thick blanket and took her to a nearby river. Under the dark, moonless sky, they weighted her down with stones and threw her into the water, watching as she sank into the depths. Claire felt a surge of relief, finally free of the doll's grasp, but the nightmare wasn't over. A week later, Claire began noticing small things around her apartment. Muddy footprints near her bed, the faint scent of river water in the air. One night, she awoke to find her bedroom window open, though she was sure she'd locked it. She closed it, but the next morning, it was open again. One evening, as she was getting ready for bed, she noticed something chilling on her nightstand. A doll-sized footprint, wet and muddy, pressed into the wood. Her hands trembled as she traced the mark, her mind racing with disbelief and terror. That night, Claire awoke to the sound of soft, childlike laughter. She turned, and there, standing at the foot of her bed, was Annabelle. Her dress soaked and tattered, her glass eyes filled with a deep, unnatural rage. "I told you," Annabelle whispered, her voice low and cruel. "I don't like to be forgotten." No one saw Claire after that night. When Mark came to check on her, the apartment was empty, with no trace of where she'd gone. But on her bed, carefully positioned on the pillow, was Annabelle, her eyes gleaming, her face twisted into a smile so wide it seemed to stretch across her delicate, painted face. And if you pass by the Lost Time antique shop at night, you might catch a glimpse of her, sitting in the shop's window display, staring out into the street, waiting patiently for her next owner.